Welcome to Homeschool Your Way. I'm your host, Janna Koch, and BookSharks Community Manager. In today's episode, I'm going to give you an insider's look into some of the most asked questions about BookShark, our methodologies, and even where we're located. But before I do, I'm going to bring in someone to help me who is known to BookShark as the school liaison. She has been around BookShark for 7 years, and Maddie Suter is going to join me in this episode. Maddie, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
We get so many questions. So many questions, and we get a lot of the same questions, obviously. But we do get a lot of interesting questions about BookShark. First of all, from how the name came about, which to you and I, it just seems so natural that that's what our name is. But,
Mhm.
deciding on how that name came about to our most recent question was if people could come in and see our warehouse and see where we store the books and how we pack our packages and where they call into if they have a question and get our customer service. So this episode is really just about answering some of those questions and giving people some insight into whether they are current BookShark users or they're even thinking about using BookShark. So quickly introduce yourself and what a school liaison does.
So like you said, have been with BookShark for 7 years. I've worked in pretty much everything from customer service all the way up. And I am now our school liaison, which means that I am your point of contact for all of our charter schools, public schools, larger co-ops who order for multiple students. I do a lot of traveling, just like Jana. So I do a lot of our school events, our larger charter events. So that's kind of where I live. But I started off in customer service. So I definitely got a lot of these questions when I was in customer service and still actually get them from some of our schools, parents that use BookShark through a charter.
I think some listeners may actually be surprised to know that we are used in public school systems, whether you, like you said, are charter or larger co-ops. I know when I'm on the floor at conventions or talking to other families and kind of giving them BookShark's background, it is very comforting for some parents to know that we are used in some of these educational systems that, brings them some comfort because they know that they're getting a curriculum that is trusted by the system. At the same time, there's a whole section of us that want to be outside of that system. So we kind of hit those two things at once when we are dealing with both a traditional homeschooler and then a public homeschooler.
I think that's one of the things that makes BookShark so unique, right? We are flexible enough to be able to be used in a hybrid situation. So some of our schools have like 2 days a week in the classroom, and then students are home the rest of the week. Some of our programs are homeschool based. So they have a teacher of record, but the parent is still doing the schooling. They're still using the same BookShark curriculum that our independent homeschoolers are using. But that's what makes BookShark so awesome, is that it's able to be modified by the user, whether that's a parent, a teacher, a grandparent, whoever is homeschooling this student can modify it to meet their needs. And that's part of the reason why BookShark is used all across the world, but especially in the United States, in charter schools all across the country from coast to coast.
Well, if you ask my family, they would tell you that they homeschooled themselves with BookShark. So I guess that even a student can be in
Yeah.
charge of their education depending on how you choose to use BookShark. Flexibility is one of the most beautiful things about BookShark. I think it's something that our family has experienced. We are in our 8th year of using BookShark, which is hard to believe that that time has gone by. One of the most, I think, important clarifications for the type of homeschool program that we say literature based. And when people hear that, you equate literature, okay, it's book based. But what I think there's like a disconnect sometimes to what that means. Like, oh, you just get a bunch of books and I read through the books. It's so much deeper than that. It's so
Mhm.
much more in depth. But for the sake of argument, let's just first talk about what is literature-based learning.
So literature-based learning is learning through literature, right? I mean, it's exactly as it sounds. So it's learning through books. However, the type of books that BookShark uses are chapter books. So we do have our textbooks that, we use for our spines, but the vast majority of any of you who use BookShark know you get that big box on your doorstep and it's full of fantastic books. And that is the base of literature-based learning, right, is chapter books and learning through reading. So learning through stories, learning through fiction and nonfiction, because they both have, their strengths. And especially when we're trying to create those pathways for students. I mean, I can tell you that I don't remember a lot about history. And I was, I went to public school for my middle and high school years. And because my brain doesn't work that way, I didn't take the lecture and the textbook as well as I probably would have maybe retained information from a chapter book. Every student learns differently, and that's part of why literature-based learning is an option, right? So there are a million different options for curriculum, for instruction style, but literature-based learning really helps build those pathways. It's a connection, right? It's a connection between you're learning about Johnny Tremaine, who lived in a certain time period, and then you go, oh, I remember that we read about this time period in my textbook. So it's kind of that cross connection between our textbooks and our chapter books.
I think one of the biggest distinctions that I have experienced is that you can know about something. So let's take, for example, the Civil War. We can know the dates, we can know the battles, we can know the sides, but it isn't until I was given a historical novel that I met the people, that I was able to experience that, war is not black and white. And especially in that particular war, you had family members on both sides, and both believed so strongly that they were willing to fight each other for it. And that's not the type of empathy that is created when you're reading a textbook. That's not the type of connection that I was given when I was just walking through history. So
Mm-hmm.
to be able to have living history, I love in our books a lot of times for the age level, the characters are the age of the children who are reading it and listening to it. So they are like, could you imagine having to see your cousin on the other side of the
Right.
battlefield or
And
not
that's
knowing?
And that's one of the things that I like to, when I'm talking to parents, I say, hey, history happened a long time ago, right? Especially for third graders now, relating to the Civil War, it happened so long ago. And, even from when I was in third grade, the world has changed, right? Technology has changed, our normal has changed, right? And so connecting to the past really kind of, like you said, as humans, we enjoy, we story tell, right? That's how things are passed down through history. That's how we communicate, right, is through stories. And so if we can teach through stories, it really kind of helps knowledge settle, and we're not just reading the facts and spitting it out, right? I mean, we're connecting with the past, and I think that is really a positive of literature-based learning. And something that we hear a lot too is, well, my student doesn't like to read. Can I still do literature-based learning? Absolutely. I mean, we have had many parents that have said, I had a student that didn't like to read, and there was one book that sparked their interest, and now they're an avid reader, right? And so don't let that term literature-based learning scare you off, because it can be a wonderful experience, especially even for students who maybe didn't enjoy reading. And the other piece of BookShark is the readers and the read alouds, right? Because we learn differently, either reading it or hearing it. And so we have this combination of readers and read alouds that allow students to process information. Some students are more auditory, so hearing it is better. So we have this great combination of how we read and how we listen to the books, and then our discussion questions. I mean, I just think those are invaluable, right? I mean, we have so many parents that say, I had discussions with my students that I never thought I would have, and they go way off track which isn't a bad thing, right? You ask a question about, what was, like you said, let's talk about, when so-and-so saw their cousin on the other side of the Civil War, how do you think that made them feel? And they start going into all these amazing conversations, which really, really helps solidify their their learning. And the other piece that I wanted to touch on was the cross subject. So especially when you look at our history and our language arts, right? It's cross subject, which is another kind of piece of that literature-based learning is you're using literature in all your subjects, even science, right? I mean, which you're sitting and reading books and then you're going and doing the experiments. So it's this cross subject literature component that makes literature-based learning unique.
For parents who are not avid readers and were not maybe read to as children, this is a new concept because let's be honest, reading out loud can be very taxing. I mean, there's actually like legit homeschool groups that have voice exercises for parents who are new to reading aloud because it is definitely a different exercise than thinking your thoughts and saying them as opposed to reading the words and then saying them. And so, as a parent who has never loved to read aloud, but has always loved to be read to, audiobooks have been an amazing part of our use of Bookshark. And some people are like, is that still reading? It absolutely is still reading. Now, in my experience, I prefer an audiobook. If it's going to be technical, I can listen to it the first go around. And then when I go to read it, I have a base for what I'm reading. It's not all foreign to me. And I think that's true for kids too. I can't be the only one that helps with. So at least when they're listening to it, they don't have to decode to read it. They can just absorb it. And then if they need to go back and read it to maybe do a little bit more of the assessments, they have like a hook that they can kind of go to and go, oh, that's where that's at because I have reference for it. I have some, base for it. So I think that's a really interesting and
Well, and
helpful
some
component.
some parents actually have their students listen to audiobooks and read alongs, especially students that struggle with pronunciation or spelling even, listening to it and also looking at it at the same time is awesome. And you can, speed up or slow down the way that at the speed an audiobook is read. So that's a super great tip for people who are maybe a little bit freaked out by the literature-based learning term because I do think, I mean, we call it book shock for a reason, right? I mean, you get this big box of books and you go, "Oh my goodness, what is this?" And but it is all planned out for you. It is we don't just send you a box of books and say, "Have at it. See you later." And it's, I think that it is a beautiful method of learning, especially and it works for students of all you know, with different strengths, with different learning types, I mean, it really can work for any student, whether they're an avid reader or not. I think there is a misconception of, well, in order to be successful with literature-based learning, my student has to be an avid reader, the kid that's under the covers with a flashlight at night, can't put a book down. And that's not the case. You can have a fantastic education with literature-based learning and not be an avid reader.
Yeah. And most likely, you will turn into an avid reader once you find that one thing, like you said, that just really changed everything for you. I know that we have now incorporated some graphic novels into our program, and that seems to have really gotten some of those kids who were like, "What? I get to read a comic? Like, you sure do." We
Yeah.
like to call it a graphic novel, so we feel better about it somehow. But yes, it's a comic book
Yeah.
and it helps, there's yeah, maybe there's less words, but you don't need as many words because the pictures are taking the words away because now you don't have to visualize it. We're showing it through the pictures. So I think that's a really fun option in our program as well. So as we are talking about literature-based learning, what is, you touched on language arts and our language arts, and we like to say it's the natural approach to learning how to read, how to write. But what does that look like in its practicality?
So the way that I like to explain it is in your younger levels, so levels A through C, you are learning to read. So we are teaching students how to read because, in kindergarten, you're learning your letters and in those younger levels, we are teaching, like you said, decoding, comprehension, all of those things that we need in order to switch over from those younger levels. Once we hit level D, when your language arts and your history are combined, now we're in reading to learn. So now we know how to read, right? I mean, we know how to read, and we may struggle here and there if, with a book or a sentence or a word, but that for the most part, we know how to read. So now we are taking what we learned in those younger levels, and now we are reading to learn. So we read a book and we learn something from it. And we learn something from all the books that we read, right? But it really kind of switches in level D, especially when you talk about the history, because in our younger levels, the readers and the language arts correlate because we're learning about, as you said, that natural based learning approach. So we learn good writing by reading good writing. So they're taking those books and they're learning more about their decoding and their writing and their comprehension and all of that. Once we hit level D, now we have discussion questions about history, right? And that continues all the way up through high school.
It is really neat when you look at our language arts program and the different components that you can add into a basic package if you feel like your student needs more phonics, if you really need them to, be able to work on vocabulary, the handwriting, those different options. But our language arts alone is really a great program, and it's in bite-sized pieces. And I know that sometimes people are like, it's not enough. I hear that often. Like, it wasn't enough. It's not enough. I would argue that it doesn't have to be a lot to be enough. If you think about red pepper flakes in a recipe, you literally need a quarter teaspoon of something and it is enough. And when you are doing enough, it doesn't necessarily have to be in a large quantity because you are teaching through the other subjects because you're reading out loud to them. And being read to is one of the biggest step ups to learning how to read.
Mhm.
So just to counter that it's not enough, I mean, obviously you and I would argue that it is plenty. And how
Mhm.
many kids, because our program is bite-sized pieces for language arts 4 days a week, are then able to read and write on their own time because they're not bogged down with assignments that they have to do. They get to
Mhm.
explore and have time to do the things they want to do. And that's something that is unique about our program as well, is that our language arts is based on writing ability and reading ability. So
Mhm.
parents will say, "Well, my child is reading way past this level." And that is decoding, right? You're decoding the words you're reading. Well, when you write, you encode. And if you don't know the code, you can't encode it. And
Right.
so you are not writing at the same level that you're reading. And I love to share to parents that if you have a reader who is advanced, they like to read. So they're
Mhm.
going to still, you be in our program, you still find time to read the books that they're interested in, still take them to the library. They're not going to stop reading just because we're using a lower level reading to match their writing at this particular phase of their education. And as soon as I say that, almost 100% of the time, parents are like, "Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It
that
clicks.
makes total sense. Yes, that works. Yes."
And I think that I love your explanation of that because we do find that especially in our younger levels, right? Because once you know how to read, you know how to read, right? I mean, once you have that decoding part down, your brain kind of takes over and you're like, "Oh, now I can read any book I want," right? I mean, for the most part, within reason, right? But I think especially in our like B and C levels, we tend to find that parents are like, "But my student is reading these chapter books and these, and that's amazing and that's so awesome." The other thing that I like to add to that is age appropriateness, right? They can read any book, that they can decode it in their brain, but content wise, is it something that we want them reading? And like you said, there are a lot of books. I mean, there are a ton of books out there that you can find at the library, on the internet, what at Barnes and Noble. And so by getting through the books that we provide that are at the correct writing level so that we don't skip any of that super important stuff, because we have to know how to write in addition to knowing how to read, right? And spelling is just one piece of that, because when they're reading, they are, learning how to spell, but they're not learning the rules of spelling, like I before E, except all of the exceptions that there are, it's like that's, so I think that, really making sure that we focus, especially in those younger levels, on that encoding part. If we miss any of that, we miss a big chunk of all of the basics that they need. And then you're kind of always playing catch up, right? I mean, you always have, and you may not see it until third, fourth, fifth grade, where you're like, ooh, we never went over that, because they're such an avid reader. But let them read for fun, because if they're only reading school books, they're not going to get to continue to foster that love of reading, right? Because then they're like, well, I don't have any time to read, whatever series I want to read, or, because they're so busy, we're challenging them so much with their school books. And that's the other piece that we want to avoid, is we don't want to overwhelm these students with so much reading that then they kind of get a little bit of it feels like a chore, right? We want them to be able to pick their books too.
Yeah. Well, because we want to foster a love of learning, not just get kids to be able to perform certain tasks that the educational system says are necessary. I think another really important question that has been asked over and over again is, how do we select the books in our BookShark levels? And we're going to kind of do a very brief overview, because obviously you'd have to be trained as one of our product development teams to be able to select books. But I think it's a great question, especially because we do have books that have gone out of print, that we have found a publishing company that will continue to print them for us. And that for some people is a little confusing. Like, if it's gone out of print, there's a reason. And then we say, well, we have this criteria as to why we think it's still a good book. So let's talk about that. I think number one, and this goes along with, delving into history and living books and with science, is realistic characters. So when we go to pick a book that's going to go into either replace a book in our level because we are updating and revamping and knowing better and doing better, or if we're creating a new level, a realistic character. So just personally for you, Maddie, what would that be?
When it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, right? With how do we make history relatable? And so a realistic character, like you said, if we're revamping, that character may not be as realistic now as it was 10 years ago, right? And so I think that is definitely one of the most important criterias, as, hey, is this character, could this be a real story, right? Could this character really have existed? Even if we're basing, the book is based on a true story, or, how do we make this character feel, does the character feel real, right? Or is it, okay, well, that was a cool story, but I don't really believe it, right? Because those books are great, not when you're using them to teach, right? I think that having a realistic character and making that character feel real really kind of draws you into that book and makes you want to keep reading.
Yeah, and I think it also makes you kind of become the character. So for me, a realistic character is, if I'm so immersed that like I'm reading it as it is me, it's happening to me, which happens a lot in books. And that is why I end up laughing and crying and getting angry, and all of my emotions are connected to it, because I am definitely seeing that either it could have been me or somebody I know or my children. And it becomes less of a story of something that happened long, long ago, and a story of, oh, that could still happen today, or how do we see that that has happened to us now in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm really proud that that is definitely one of the things that we do in order to pick a book. The second one is solid character development. And some people might be like, why does that matter? But I think it's kind of like C number one.
Yeah, it is, because I mean, we've all read books, right, where we just can't get into it, or you read the first couple chapters and you're like, ugh, like it just doesn't, it's flat. And that character development is a huge part of that because, and I mean, I will say our product development team is amazing, and I don't even know half of what they do because they're just so incredible at picking these books and making them work with what we're teaching. But that is, they have to, part of character development is they have to change, right? I mean, if let's say it's, a a hero in the story, right? That maybe starts out as not such a nice guy, right? And then ends up as the hero. That is solid character development, right? Or, hey, maybe when you're thinking about, young children, right? We're learning about how to share and how to, be a nice person. And maybe we weren't sharing in the beginning. And now, I mean, that character development, if that doesn't happen, you don't really have a story, right? Because you think about all movies and books, they all have this, they have the very tippy top. And then it kind of, you have a little dip like, oops, maybe that, and then they learn their lesson, right? And it's this, that's what makes a story so good. But those two really go hand in hand because if you don't have realistic characters, then you don't really have character development either because they're not realistic things aren't happening in the book, right? So those two really kind of go hand in hand.
Well, and life is in the struggle. We all want to, I think we all work really hard to make our paths really smooth. But as adults, we all know that it is in the struggle where we actually learn and we develop our character. And so to read that to our children, to make it relatable and say, hey, see, this character was having a really hard time with this, and they overcame that. And you can too. I think it really is encouraging for students to hear that in the things that they're learning and then how that applies to history. This is an age-old human problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's always an issue that we have to overcome. And
Yep.
yeah, it may take us a couple tries and we may fail along the way, but nobody typically likes to read a story that doesn't
It's
end
just all
end
good,
well.
right? It's all good, it's all great, everything's fine, right? I mean, that's not really fun either, right? Because that's not realistic. Like you said, the road of life is bumpy, and that's okay. And that, I think those lessons that we learn are super important. And learning that through literature is super special because like you said, maybe some of our students are going through something similar, or, they can kind of take something from those books and apply them in their own life, even though it's a book about that happened during the Civil War, right? I mean, life life happens in a similar kind of pattern, right? And so a third grader during the Civil War may have some of those same thoughts and feelings as a third grader in 2024.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to think about like unless you actually stop and think about it, right?
Right.
Like you're not really aware of it and you're like, "Oh, wait, this does kind of work." The third criteria that we want to talk about is the context really enriches the reader's cultural experience. And I love how these all kind of work together because of our amazing book choices, I have learned so much about different cultures. And anyone who has talked to me, either on the phone or in a convention booth, knows that I love Level F, which is Eastern Hemisphere. And
Mm-hmm.
the stories and the knowledge that I gained from reading through that and going through it twice with both sets of my kids was it was actually like life changing to hear that there's a reason behind these things that happen. Because if you're culturally unaware of how different people groups do different things, you're going to go, well, why don't they just not do it that way anymore? You know what I mean? Like we're ignorant to their history and why they choose to do the things that they do, even though if from our perspective, they could do it differently and a lot easier, right? But
Right.
that's not what they're choosing. And there's a reason why they're not choosing that. So being immersed in the culture of what you're learning, whether it's early American history, or ancient civilizations, you're having these stories that are just like, wow, I had no idea. I had no idea why the country Pakistan and how the country Pakistan came about until I was in level F and I read through the books and got the context and was like, "Oh, well now it makes perfect sense." But it didn't before.
Right. And it's kind of a cool way you can travel the world and travel. It's like a books can be like a time machine, right? You can read them and understand and have a little bit better understanding of the people around you and the world around you. And I think that only happens when you have, content that not only talks about the story, right? Because the story is important, but let's also talk about why this story even happened in the first place, right? Because of culture or time period or, whatever it may be. I think it's not, the story is a big part of it, but let's also understand why this is happening in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. And the implications of how it's happening. Like that's the other part that I think is so impactful. It's like, okay, we see these conflicts in different countries that have gone on for centuries. And as a young country, we kind of go like, why doesn't everyone just get over it? Like we don't get why they're still fighting over these things. But when you are seeing the implications of historical events, and then putting a character to it and then learning about it through almost like first person as you're reading
Mhm.
those stories, it really does expand your worldview. And as a as an American, I love learning about other cultures. I don't think that was something that was encouraged as a kid. I don't think that was even something that was like talked about. I mean, we were very like nationally centric, right? Like we just talked about America. You learned a lot about America, but man, there wouldn't even be an America without Europe, and there wouldn't be a Europe without the ancient civilizations. And so yeah, I could go on and on about this one, but I think it's definitely a really important one.
Mhm.
Okay, so then the next one is intriguing and multi-dimensional. And I think you can speak to that because you really expounded on that a little bit before, but tell us why that is important.
I mean, it's amazing how all of these points kind of go together, right? Because if the book is flat, nobody wants to read it, right? I mean, and multidimensional, I think their multidimensional plot is the key word, right? Because you don't want to just focus on one piece of the puzzle, right? Because a book is like a puzzle. It's all these different pieces that come together and create this, or like a patchwork quilt, right? It's like it all these pieces that sort of maybe don't seem like they fit together come together and make this beautiful story. And it has to be multidimensional. It has to have layers. It has to draw the reader in. And, again, part of multidimensional is characters, location, all of the things that we just talked about. If those are not, if they're all the same, right? If it's like, okay, well, it's this person in their house that, and the house is blue. Okay. I mean, I think that piece is so important, and that multidimensional piece kind of makes it intriguing, right? But all of those things don't happen without the first three that we talked about. So I think it's, they all really kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah. And the depth of the literature then makes it so much more than I mean, I always classify there's some books that I like to read that I consider just like brain candy. I don't have to think really hard. I'm just
Mhm.
being entertained. And while I think there is value in those type of books, I read them all the time. And we see that kind of too, depending on the student's maturity, right? We want them to love to read. So we're going to give them that fun, just not super complicated,
Yeah,
if it,
brain
Little
candy.
House,
I love that word.
yes. Like it's like, okay, but we want to keep them coming back. And then as they age up and they're going through our levels, you're getting into some very complex character development, very deep cultural tensions that run centuries, and it's things that you don't necessarily think on a day-to-day basis, right? You're not really contemplating these different concepts in your everyday when you're getting up, going to work, getting your groceries done, and making dinner and being
Right.
entertained for a little bit before you go to bed. But reading through these books and letting someone else have picked them, which I really, I
Mhm.
really, as a homeschool parent, I really love that someone else did all the heavy lifting on
Yeah.
this. Um, so the next one is emotionally compelling. I mean, yeah, we've kind of it does feel like it's like the stepping, like we're getting to like the culmination because you have to be drawn in, you have to connect. Otherwise, why do I care? Why do I care if the character reaches their goal or finds their, paradise or whatever it is?
And I think you're so right. I mean that, the character development, the multidimensional plot, all of that moves into a story that moves you, right? A story that makes you go, "Oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you know, they completed their goal or they did, it's like you said earlier that feeling like that story is happening to you, you feel all those emotions, right? And so if it's done right, if all of those, four things that we've talked about are done right, when the character, stumbles, you go, "Oh gosh," and it hurts your heart a little, and I think it's in those moments where the learning really sticks because you go, "Oh my gosh, I feel for that character like they're a friend, right? Or like it was me or my parent or my sibling or, and it's that piece that makes a student go, "Oh, in a conversation, when they're older and in the workforce, and they're maybe talking to a friend and American history comes up and they're like, "Oh my gosh, I read this great book when I was in fourth grade." And, I think those are the moments where even if it's, I mean, it's not always in the forefront of your brain, right? But they kind of get shelved away, those, because when you have an emotional connection to a story, you remember it, right? And so that's the piece that makes that learning really, really stick forever.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely. I mean, like I said, I can remember a story that I read in fourth grade. It was about World War II, and I stuck in that time period for decades, just
Mm-hmm.
reading anything I could because it was something that hasn't happened to me, right? But it was something that I carried such a heaviness for that it happened to other people. And I think that is something that you can't create empathy without being intentional. And I think these books are so intentional to help create students who are able to think outside of their immediate needs and surroundings and go, "Oh, that's pretty sad that that
Yeah.
happened to them," right? Instead of, "Oh, well, why does it matter? It didn't affect me."
Right. And I think, and I mean, I read a book in third grade that to this day is still one of my favorite books. And in my 20s, I finally was able to go and see the place where the book was written. And it was emotional for me as an adult. And I read the book a long time ago, right? But it was emotional for me because I remember feeling the feelings of the characters when I was reading this book in third grade, right? Third or fourth grade. And I think and I mean, I could probably recite the story to you by heart, right? Because it's one of those books, I still have it sitting in my bookshelf. It's well worn and well loved, right? But those things stick with you. And like you said, they stick with you for decades. I mean, sometimes forever, right? I mean, because you built this emotional connection. It's like when you make a friend, right? Even if that friend isn't always around, you still have that emotional connection to them because you've had different emotions and you've built this, this friendship. And I always used to little my books, my friends, because they were, it felt like they were my friends. It's all these stories and all these, I mean, I was that kid. My mom used to have to tell me to turn the light off and go to bed because I couldn't put the books down, right? But I mean, and still as an adult, I love a good book. And like you said, some of the brain candy, I love that too. But every once in a while, I just want a really good historical novel or something that teaches me something because it's a workout for my brain.
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that is on our list is verbally beautiful. So a book that, you mentioned the word flat a couple times. There built into our program is one of the things I have always loved is our wordly wise, which is vocabulary.
Mhm.
And because I am an avid reader and really encourage my children to read, I will use words that I don't think are showy. I just think that's the word that I feel like using. And my kids will be like, what does that mean? Now I'm grateful that they ask, but I'm always like, what do you mean? First of all, why can't you grab it from the context of what I'm saying? But okay, if you need me to tell you what it is, and then I give the simpler version of it. And they said, why didn't you just say that? And I said, because we live in a world where we have beautiful word choices. And we don't have to use the same word over and over and over again. We can use the thesaurus and change out some words and make it flow and make it easy to read so that we're not stumbling and it doesn't feel choppy. And so these books that are chosen are really chosen because of the way they flow, not only in the character development, the multi-dimension of the plot and all of these things, but literally the sound, the cadence, because we are talking about some of these are read alouds and they need to sound aesthetically pleasing.
Mhm. And I think, I mean, I love what you said about it not being showy, right? It's not you're not throwing in words just because you know a better word for because, or, because you know a better word for colorful, right? But the way that the author chooses their words really does affect the story, right? Because there are no pictures. So you have to have these beautiful descriptive words, and sometimes that word, yeah, I know that there is a simpler term for what I'm trying to describe, but maybe you're emotionally connected to it and you want to give it more oomph, right? I think that, and again, I mean, it goes back to being flat, right? I mean, like you said, it's got to be entertaining for our ears and our brains. And I think, I mean, our books are just so well picked by our product development team that, I mean, I think all of our books have that beautiful, storytelling, combination of all of these things that we talked about while still being the cadence. And I mean, everything is just so well done that none of our stories are boring.
Yeah. And for those stories that we have heard, like, oh, we couldn't get into it, my kid didn't like it. I mean, everyone has their different preferences, right? You
Right.
think about food, like some like it salty, some like it sweet, some like it spicy, some like it bland. I mean, it's okay that you don't love every single book that you read. I
Yeah.
will say that 9 times out of 10, in the 8 years that we've been doing this, there are books where we started and I was like, oh, okay, I don't know, and I either switched to the audio and enjoyed it so much better, or I pushed through. My rule was always like, get through 100 pages. Let's give it a chance.
Mhm.
Don't judge a book by its cover, but also don't judge a person within the first meeting, right? So like, let's give it a chance. You'll have a first impression in those first couple chapters, and you're like, oh, are you kidding me? But give it time to develop and then make your decision. And we're not, and you may not, you may stop reading a book, and that's okay. You may replace it either with the movie or a different book. And that's just part of making it your own. But I would say there are very few books that we couldn't get through. And if there was a time where we just stopped and we picked it up later, and then we ended up loving it. We were just in a different mood, in a different place. The stars were aligned differently. I'm not sure, but it worked.
Have you found that, because, like you said, you have your two different groups, right? So you went through level F twice. You've gone through most of our levels twice. Have you found that, if there was a book that you either really liked or really didn't like the first time and then had a different feeling on it the second time?
For sure, because when you start it the first time, it took a while to get into. But when you start it the second time, you're already excited because that like, oh, this is going to be a good one. One of the ones that actually happened to us is called The Great and Terrible Quest. And when I
Mhm.
first started reading it, I was like, oh, and I'm kind of looking at the kids and they're just like, meh. And I'm like, okay. But by the end of it, it was so good. So when I picked it up the second time with my younger daughter, I was like, oh, just hold on. It's gonna get good. And, I really enjoyed it the second time through. You know, I mean, can't I guess I can't speak for my children, but yeah,
I think
definitely.
I think that is also something to kind of keep in mind when you're reading these books, especially if, you're a homeschool parent that has, a second wave that's coming through, the books, you can also even really like a book the first time. And then the second time you're like, maybe not. I think, like you said, you can be in a different mood. You can be in a different, I love your get through the first 100 pages. And if you still are having a really hard time getting through it, it's okay to just drop it and come back to it, and say, okay, maybe we'll try this again. And if you try it again and you don't like it, that's okay, because everybody's different, right? Education is not one size fits all. Every human is different, right? And everybody has different experiences and different, pieces that they're kind of, from their lives that they're working with. And so it's okay to not like a book, but I love your give it a chance, right? Because some books are a slow start, and some books you get to the end and you're like, oh, that's not how I thought that was going to end. And I maybe wish it would have ended a little bit differently, right? So giving it a chance and trying to kind of see if that, you know, if all of those, like maybe it's the character development that draws you in, maybe it's the descriptiveness of the setting or whatever it is. Maybe there's just one thing that catches your attention and pulls you in, but it might not be until the third or fourth chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that really wraps up that readability, that it's rereadable, that
Mm-hmm.
you do really want to either reread it from once you get to the end and go, oh, maybe I missed something. Maybe my focus was on the wrong place as I was reading this because I'm completely confused or caught off guard.
Yeah.
Or, the other thing is I just feel like some selections of our books people really scratch their head about. And I actually like that because it stretches us. We can't always be given candy. We have to be given things that cause us to think things through a different way that aren't always a simple, up and down. Like sometimes you need to go round and around and around and to get back down. And because you have all these other aspects of the culturally relevant and the character development and realistic character, because you have all of these things, I just feel like we have built our literature-based learning on a trustworthy criteria that people can trust that if we did pick a book, whether you love it or hate it at the end, it has value for the level that it's put in. And so definitely give it a chance. Before we go, Maddie, the other thing that was asked by our customers was the warehouse and office where we're located. And although we are closed to tours, what is something that we're kind of toying with about doing for our customers?
Yeah, so we are close to the public, but I think, some of the things that we've talked about is, could we do maybe a video tour and, have show the process of, because I mean, if you think about it, look at how many books we have, right? Our warehouse is huge. And so I think for customers being able to see that, that process of, wow, look at all those books, and then to see the high bay with all of the boxes and boxes and boxes of books. I mean, it's a pretty cool process. So I think there's definitely, you know there could potentially be a space for us to, maybe you and I go in and record, picking and packing and, showing the receiving process and just all of the, because I mean, I would be curious, right? I was curious when I was hired. I was like, where do you keep all these books? Like because there are so many. So that's definitely something that we've kind of been toying with, is doing a video tour of, and, all the way through the process of once the order comes through to us, how does it get from our website to your front door?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be a lot of fun. The other thing is if people have an opportunity to come to a convention that we are attending, you can see the different levels in the different books. So we don't have all of the books for every level, but we have samples of every level and then all of the books for levels A and level D. And so that is a great way to get in, kind of pick up and get into your hands like, oh, what am I going to look forward to? Or what does this really look like? Because, some things do seem so flat when they're on the computer screen, but when you can
And
make it intangible.
I think the other amazing part is that Janna and our convention reps are there. You can talk to them. They're moms that have used the program with their kids. They have some amazing suggestions that, I mean, I would have never thought of. And they have real life experience using the program and have suggestions like, hey, just read the first 100 pages of the book or add that wordly wise in because it's amazing, right? I mean, when you look at our website, you don't, you see everything that's included and you can customize your package and all of that. But I really think that if you can go and be in person and look at the materials and talk to one of our amazing convention reps, it will really help. Even if you're a current Bookshark user, just, even if you've used Bookshark for 2, 3 years, going and talking to somebody has, it can kind of change. Maybe it changes the way that you do your day to day, right? You add something in here, shuffle something around. So I think that that is another huge benefit of going to the conferences. And you can find our conference schedule on our website, right, Janna?
You can. Yep. Yep. Under our About tab, and then it says convention schedule. So that is current and up to date. Maddie, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and answer these pressing questions of our not only customers, but potential customers, people who are thinking about Bookshark. And now that they have kind of gotten a better idea of what the methodology is behind it, maybe they'll have some other questions to ask us in the future.
Absolutely. And our customer service team and our convention reps and our advisors are always happy to answer any questions. So take this as don't hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to help.
We are. And we'll be putting in the show notes how you can get in touch with all of those departments, customer service and our reps and our advisors. So make sure to check the show notes. Thank you guys so much. Until next time. Bye-bye.